Good evening, everyone. Oh, wow, everybody's so well behaved. Everybody got quiet. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenny Moore. I'm the director of Tinworks Art. It's so fantastic to see so many folks tonight, our second in a series of In Conversation about food and farming, also our second sold-out event. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for your ticket purchases. Thank you for your donations. After we have tonight's conversation, we'll tell you about the next two, so please tell your friends and tell them to get their tickets because this is a very popular event. We're thrilled to have you here tonight for the second in our series between Mary Murphy and Sarah Calhoun, titled This House of Food, Stories from Montana Kitchens. If you are new to Tinworks, we are a nonprofit, experimental, inclusive art space located in the Northeast neighborhood, whose mission is to connect artists and audiences in meaningful ways. Tinworks is situated on indigenous land that many people have called home before they were displaced, including the Blackfeet, Crow, Cheyenne, Salish, and Sioux peoples, and we acknowledge and honor their presence and land, past, present, and future. Our series of monthly conversations on food and farming have been inspired by an artwork featured in our upcoming 2024 exhibition program, Agnes Denes' Wheatfield. If you have been past our site, our 1.5 acre field on the corner of Ida and Cottonwood, you will see that the wheat indeed has sprouted and is growing. Those of you who are wheat farmers in the audience, this is a very new experience for me, and every day is a journey of farming wheat. But the work was inspired, or this series has been inspired by this work by Agnes Denes, who in this image you will see, in 1982 planted a 2-acre field of wheat in Lower Manhattan in the landfill that was created from the construction of the World Trade Centers. We're very honored that Agnes accepted the invitation from Tinworks to reconsider the work 40 years later. It's the first time she's reconsidered or considered the opportunity to think about this work in an American institution. And in the first Wheatfield A Confrontation, Agnes described it as about food, energy, commerce, world trade, economics, mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns. It was an intrusion in the citadel, a confrontation of high civilization. Then again, it was Shangri-La, a small paradise, one's childhood, a hot summer afternoon in the country, peace, forgotten values, and simple pleasures. All of these topics, 42 years later, all of us are in the room to consider. There are many ways to participate in this work. Agnes does consider it a new work, Wheatfield, an inspiration. The seed is in the ground. I could talk on and on about Agnes's work. That will be the focus of the last conversation in our series, but I encourage you to please go to our website to learn more about Agnes's project. While the seed is in the ground in the field at Tinworks, she invites you to be part of the art by planting wheat in any fallow piece of land available to you in solidarity with Wheatfield. We will have wheat seeds available this weekend at the Earth Day celebration at the fairgrounds, and we'll also have it available for our Give Big Donor Lounge May 3rd. So we'll have wheat seeds available for you to plant in your yard, any fallow piece of land available to you. We're fortunate to have many organizations and people to thank for this series, for their work and involvement that has made this program possible. Our speakers, of course, Mary and Sarah. Our lead sponsors, the Rialto, Gutalauna, the Lark, Root Cellar Foods, Farm to Craig, Quality Foods Distributing, Happy Trash Can, the Ivan Doig Center for the Study of the Land and Peoples of the North American West, and our supporting sponsors, Gallatin Valley Farm to School, MSU College of Education, Health and Human Development, North Fork Financial and Open and Local, and in-kind support from our Treeline Coffee Roasters, the Emerson Center for the Arts and Culture, and the Country Bookshelf, who you'll see out front when you came in, who have books available for sale on topic. I think Mary is the one who selected the books for this evening. Thank you to the donors and supporters, folks in our local community and farther afield for your contributions to Tinworks throughout the year. Thank you to our excellent board of directors and our team at Tinworks, particularly for tonight's event in the series, our curatorial assistant, Brian Mango, and the extraordinary Angela Yonke, our community outreach and education manager. And of course, Mary Stein, who has been our partner in all of this. Mary is a community leader in sustainable food system endeavors and recently retired program leader of the Sustainable Food and Bioenergy Systems degree program at Montana State University. Mary was the thought leader in how we could structure these conversations and who would be a great voice for these topics. Her advocacy of sustainable food systems inspired this series, and as evidenced by all of your presence, her talent shines in bringing folks together around the important topics of food, farming, and community. Mary, I'm going to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Jenny. It's so great to see all of you here tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce this wonderful pair of women who will be in conversation tonight. These two women are friends. They're both natural storytellers, and they've bonded over their shared passion for the writings of Ivan Doig. Sarah Calhoun and Mary Murphy will be bringing the past to life as they take us on a journey of the culinary history of this place through their conversation, This House of Food, Stories from Montana Kitchens. So let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Sarah Calhoun, who is our host for tonight's conversation, is the owner of Red Ants Pants, the executive director of the Red Ants Pants Foundation, and the producer of Red Ants Pants Music Festival, which, if you have not seen the lineup for this summer, it is so good. The Red Ants Pants Music Festival was named the event of the year by the Montana Office of Tourism. Sarah's been inducted into the Montana Business Hall of Fame. She's been named to the National Women in Business Champion for the Small Business Administration. She's been named Entrepreneur of the Year for the state of Montana, and she's dedicated to supporting rural communities, and women's leadership has given 2 TED Talks, dozens of keynote talks, and has gained national press through such wide-reaching outlets as CNN, Bloomberg, National Geographic, New York Times, Huffington Post, and more. That's Sarah. So Sarah will be in conversation with the amazing Mary Murphy. Mary is an American historian who has taught courses on the history of gender, the North American West, and the history of food at Montana State University since 1990. And one aside here is that Mary's food classes were the favorites of my students while I was teaching up at MSU. She directed the Ivan Doig Center for the Study of Lands and Peoples of the American West and was the Michael P. Malone Professor of History from 2005 to 2010. Mary was also named Distinguished Professor in the College of Letters and Science and is a past recipient of the Montana Governor's Humanities Award. She's the author of a number of fascinating books. I won't name them here, they're in her bio. But what I'm particularly excited about is that Mary is currently writing a culinary history of Montana, along with colleagues Molly Kruckenberg, Zoe Ann Stoltz, and Jan Zauha. I can't wait for that to come out. Please help me welcome our conversation pair for this evening, Sarah Calhoun and Mary Murphy. Oh, you need a microphone. Sarah, yours is right there.
Oh, we each have a mic. Okay, all right. I know mine's on. Oh, no, maybe Mary turned it off. Okay, all right. Okay.
Well, good evening, Mary.
Good evening, Sarah.
And thank you, Mary and Jenny, and all of you for coming for this, what's about to be an enjoyable conversation. I'm very excited to pull some lovely stories out of your wise mind, Mary.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So where do you want to start? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got into writing about food?
Yeah, okay. So, and I thought I would first start with Ivan Doig, because we're going to talk about one of his homelands tonight as an example. But I first came to Montana in 1980, just 2 years after this House of Sky was published. And it was the first book that everybody I talked to when I said, what should I read about Montana, told me. So that's, in some ways, it's kind of how I learned my way around Montana. And then a few years ago, we were able to, with the great gift from Carol Doig, start the Doig Center at MSU, and along with Susan Colleen, my colleague in the English department, we were able to run that center and try to bring even wider appreciation for Ivan Doig. And I just am curious, how many of you have read this House of Sky? Yeah, so we know you. And so we've turned to Sarah, and Sarah's going to talk about her connection with Ivan. I did know Ivan before he died, and in some of his research trips and coming to Montana, we shared that love of Montana history, because before he was a novelist, he was a historian, so dear to my heart. But I came to the study of the history of food through a very serendipitous path. I was not trained in it. I never got to take any of Mary's classes. I broke my shoulder several years ago, and I had on my dominant right arm, and I was in a sling for a long time. I really messed it up. And I was at the same time looking for a new topic to research, a new project on women's history. And I would think about this and I'd think about that. I thought, oh, maybe I'll do a book on women's activism, but truthfully I had said everything I had to say about Jeanette Rankin, and I just couldn't bring myself to do that. And then I started thinking about all the kind people who had brought food to me when I couldn't cook. And I started thinking about how practically everyone who had brought a dish brought a special dish that had a story attached to it. And then I started thinking about Montana women's history. Some of you might know that until 1940, the most common job for women in Montana was domestic service. And that meant cooking or cleaning, but not professional work. There were very few professional opportunities. There was no industry to speak of that hired women. And so I started thinking, how do women in a capitalist society where we tend to measure worth by income or title or position, how do women who are doing domestic work, and often in rural places, get a sense of satisfaction, maybe gain a reputation? And it was like a light bulb went off. It was food. That's the way. So that is what set me on this path. So why don't you tell us about your connection to Ivan?
Yes, and thank you, Mary. So I grew up on a farm back in Connecticut, ended up moving west, wanting to start this company making work pants for women because no one was making them. And moved to Bozeman, Montana, sight unseen. I'd never been here. Spent about a year learning about the apparel industry and all the things, making some great connections. And after about a year, it was too big of a town for me. I grew up in a town about the size of, 1,200 people. So this was just a big city even back then, and this was 2004. And someone had recommended this House of Sky to me, so I read it and immediately fell in love with this idea of White Sulphur Springs. And what I loved so much about Ivan's writing was just how real and genuine it was. There's so much cachet around Montana, as we all know, but he talks about the hard parts too, and the grit and the wind and the really long winters that we are still going through. So it sounded to me like authentic Montana, and I went and visited White Sulphur Springs in Marr County. Not Meager, it is Marr County. And one visit and I was sold, and that was, I definitely found authentic Montana and what I was looking for. It's a 900-person ranching town, like you all hopefully know, about 2,000 people in the whole county. And it has become a home for Red Ants Pants and our festival, and my home as well personally. So it's been pretty neat.
Mm-hmm. And I might add that Sarah has one other connection to Ivan in that the house that she now owns, part of that house is where Ivan wrote part of this House of Sky.
Yeah, quite something. So if you fast forward 20 years, well, actually not even that long. Ivan at one point wrote a letter to me, and I was very excited to become a pen pal with him. And he had said he had heard of his influence on my moving to White Sulphur, and he was very glad I had found his hometown and am making it perk. And so, of course, I was delighted to hear from him. So we started writing. I got to meet him at that country bookshelf signing I think, about 6 months before he passed. Got to know Carol, who wears red ants pants, and then carried on. And then literally probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was able to purchase the old Ringling mansion where I did not know this till probably the 8th time walking through the house. And then Marga, the woman I bought it from, who had grown up in the home, she just offhandedly mentioned, oh, and this is where Ivan and Carol lived back in 77 when he was writing this House of Sky. And I was like, oh, talk about full circle. And she sent me his journal entries from that summer. And I think even in the foreword, they talk about living in the old Ringling place. So pretty neat.
So we thought that it was a great opportunity because Ivan, in his books, actually does write a lot about food. And in this House of Sky, of course, he writes a lot about his grandmother, who was a ranch cook. So we thought we would talk about examples from our county tonight, me telling you some of the stories that I found in my historic research, and Sarah being able to offer stories about some of the people from those same families who live in White Sulphur, other stories that she's heard from old-timers about the people that we're going to talk about. So, and then afterwards, of course, we'd love it if Montana is that long, small town where everybody knows somebody. And so if you have stories to share with us, we would love that as well. So I wanted to start with Bessie Ringer. For those of you who, I can really abbreviate Ivan's biography since so many of you have read the book, but Ivan was the son of Charlie Doig, who was a cowboy, and Bernetta Ringer, who was the daughter of Bessie and Tom, who worked really arduous work. We talked about the work on a dairy farm. And Bessie was very skeptical of Charlie when he came to court Bernetta, because he started courting her when she was 15. And he was significantly older. So they had a 6-year courtship, married just before she was 21, and unfortunately, she died of asthma when Ivan was just 6 years old. So I want to start the story of ranch cooks, because what happened was, in this House of Sky, I think the only person in his works that Ivan actually gives a different name to is the stepmother he had for a few years, who was a cook on a ranch that Charlie was working. He worked as a foreman on ranches, and then later he worked on shares. And as Ivan said, he made all the decisions, he took all the risks, and maybe if there was a profit, he got a share of that. But this young, very attractive woman was the cook, and within 3 months, Charlie had married her. And Ivan, I am a historian, so I have to have a quote. But Ivan wrote in his book a paragraph or a description of ranch cooks, which I think is really important to us to understand the identity or lack of identity of Western rural women. So he said, he's commenting on the woman he called Ruth. Never before did I see anyone quite like her on a ranch. Ranch cooks generally were stout spinsters or leathery widows, worn dour and curt by a life which gave them only the chore of putting meals on the table for a dozen hungry men 3 times a day. So alike were cooks usually that the hired men seldom bothered to learn their names, simply called each one Mrs. So, for those who are interested in the history and the contemporary life of rural women, there's nothing more powerful than that statement of invisibility, that the people you cooked for couldn't even be bothered to learn your name. So that's one of the reasons why I like to do this work. My whole career has been researching the lives of working people and trying to bring their story into the narrative of American history. So cooking is a particularly, to me now, interesting way to do that, because so often cooks are anonymous, right? They're in the kitchen, they're at the market, but the people who eat their food don't even know their names at times. Do you have an experience of that, or see that with your work with rural women?
Well, in what I see when just in the ranching community, and when I get to go, I used to do this more when I had more free time, but get to go to brandings or shipping parties, it's the women are right there along with the men roping and gathering and bringing them in and doing all the work and the vaccinations and everything step by step, hour by hour, all day, and then still preparing all the meals that they did the night before and getting it all ready and then doing all the hosting, which always blows my mind. And it goes just as this unspoken, almost an expectation, but they seem to do it flawlessly still, which is always impressive to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So what happens with Ivan and his family is Ruth and Charlie are mismatched from the beginning. And Ivan says in the book, the most tragic thing about their marriage is that they let it go on so long. And so they divorce, and Charlie's having a bout of ill health. And Ivan is, now 8, 9 years old. And so he's worried what is going to happen. And he, as I said, he and Bessie had not really gotten along very well. So he finally decides that for Ivan's sake, he's going to go to Bessie and ask her to join their family. And she loves Ivan. And in fact, Charlie was afraid that he was always afraid that Bessie would try to swoop in and take Ivan, judging that he really couldn't take care of him doing the work he did. So, they form this household. There's a lot of tension and wrangling at the beginning. And then at one point, Charlie gets an offer to go on shares and to manage this ranch outside of White Sulphur Springs. So Ivan portrays Charlie as courting Bessie in terms of, can he get her to move with them to this ranch? And what he has in mind is that she will become the ranch cook. So he comes home from work to the house that he and Ivan and Bessie are sharing, and he tells her all these stories about how the current cook, cooks the steak till it's as tough as shoe leather and serves, quote, God forbid, store-bought bread. So he's playing on, Bessie's pride as a good cook, and so she kind of says, yeah, okay, we can go and do that. And the thing that I think is, again, important from understanding their lives, and throughout all of Ivan's work is this thread of respect for working people. And he tells the story that's exactly like what Sarah told of contemporary ranch women, so that Bessie now is serving 3 meals a day to the cowboys and hands on this ranch, and then after the day is over, after Charlie comes back having worked equally as long, the two of them go out to the hayfield to repair machinery, because she had done all kinds of ranch work as well. So to me, the book is, I in some ways I have found ranch cooks in some ways the most elusive women to try and track down, because they don't show up like when I'm researching Butte or Helen. I can look in the city directory, look for their name, try to find something about them. They don't really show up unless you had somebody's ranch records that kept the name of who they were paying. I don't really know how much they earned. I don't know what kind of turnover there was. We do have this really cool record from the 1930s. The federal government had a program called the Federal Writers Program to hire unemployed writers. And they were going to do a book called America Eats, collecting lore about food in all different regions of the country. And Montana was the center of the Western Project. And they sent these writers out to ranches and to little towns. And one goes, even Sarah doesn't know about this yet because I just found it, one goes to White Sulphur Springs, and he goes to a ranch, and he writes up the story of how the bell rings and the cowboys gather for breakfast and what's on the table and the lingo that they use, which Ivan would have loved because he kept a notebook in his pocket and he would eavesdrop on people, and if he heard a phrase that he thought was a really great vernacular phrase, he would write that down. So the cowboys would say, pass the sand, which meant pass the sugar, pass the grease, which meant pass the butter, pass the ditch water, which meant pass the coffee. Then he tells us what's for lunch. Then he falls asleep after lunch when the cowboys go back to work, and then he tells us what happens at dinner. And so you can just see the pace of what it would have taken for the ranch cook to produce that food day in and day out. Should we talk about harvest time?
Yes, yes. And it's funny, all these, I mean, the cooks are it's so fundamental to, it's the most important part of any operation, haying or threshing or harvest time, hunting camps, all of it. We need good cooks, and we need to recognize the better.
Yeah.
Yes, let's talk about harvest and threshing crews.
Okay. Yeah. Because Ivan did say, I forgot, he does have a great quote in the book, what Charlie says to Bessie when he's trying to convince her. A crew is only as good as the cook.
Yep, absolutely.
Which I'm sure many of you have heard.
Yep.
Yeah.
And like many unfortunate things, women's stories are not recorded and their names are not celebrated. So working on changing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, let's talk about harvest.
Okay. So one of the things that we've been, that we researched, my colleagues and some of them who are in Helena, one's over at the Montana Library Association, actually talking about this project, is the threshing crew, feeding a threshing crew in the early 20th century. So regardless of what grain you were growing, you would have to, you just couldn't, and as Tinworks will learn, you just can't send the whole stock with the grain off to the bakery, right? It has to be, the grain has to be released, it has to be threshed, so that a farmer can take that grain to the grain elevator and then sell it. So that was, as many of you know, very dependent upon weather, and for the women in that family, it was a months-long preparation. So in the early days before custom threshing outfits, farmers would form in an area would form what was called a threshing ring, and basically it was a neighborhood agreement that they would help each other out during the threshing period. So the women in the neighborhood would, loosely speaking neighborhood, but they would go to each other's houses to help cook. But it was the responsibility of the owner of the farm to provide all that food. So for months, from the previous summer to the next summer, they would have canned fruits and vegetables. One woman in an oral history talks about how they grew an early ripening cabbage so that they could make sauerkraut because the threshing crews loved sauerkraut. And they would save up, all their special foods. But it was tricky because the meat was a central part of these harvest dinners. And by the harvest dinner, I mean the midday meal. The midday meal was the main meal of the day, and it was always called dinner. The meat was the centerpiece, and the workers expected fresh meat. But the owners of the place had to decide, well, when should I butcher that hog, or when should I butcher that beef? Because there's no refrigeration and you don't want it to go bad. And the women had to sort of figure out all those logistics, know when to have the food. And the weather would be a key point in this because, what if your grain wasn't quite ready when you thought it was going to be? Or what was even worse is, what if machinery broke down and the threshers were there for several more days? And one story, actually it was a story from Mark County, Harold Zenter tells this story, that a piece of steam equipment ran into a slough, fell over, and his mother had thought, oh, good, they're gone. We've exhausted all the food, I've exhausted my friendship, et cetera, and now she had to feed them for an extra week because it took them that long to get the equipment out. But the threshing dinners were also places where women's talents could really shine. So they wanted to show their best foods for a couple of reasons. One, it was a way for them to gain a reputation. And in one memoir, a woman writes about how women love to hear a person say, "Did you taste those biscuits? I think I ate a dozen. They were the best biscuits ever." Or, "Did you see how high that cake was?" And they just loved those stories, right? But the other thing that sort of emerges in some of the records is women also wanted to please the threshers so that they would want to come back the next year. Because people who served the threshing crew bad food, it was hard for them to get crew. Have you come across that?
Well, that tracks for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And if there's one thing that happens, it's when you're using a piece of equipment, it's always going to break down. That is also true. And now we see the custom cutters come up. They start in Texas when the harvest is ready and move up the whole Rocky Mountain, up the prairies as the grain is getting ready with all their combines. And it's quite something when you see them coming through town, for sure.
Yeah.
And they've got to be fed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, I just so enjoyed researching that topic because of the, these stories of celebration and of great food, but there were also some really poignant stories. So during World War I, after the United States joined in the war in 1917, the U.S. Food Administration did not impose rationing. We didn't have formal legal rationing in World War I. It was all supposed to be voluntary. But people who wanted to be patriotic, tried to abide by, I would say voluntary, but with a lot of peer pressure. And so, reduced amounts of sugar. This is when we had the meatless Mondays and the wheatless Wednesdays. So this one young woman, she marries, and her first time of hosting a threshing party of her husband, had crops that need to be threshed, and she had watched the spread that her mother put on, and so she wanted to match the plenty that her mother had produced. And so she talks in a memoir written 50 years after this experience about how she and her family saved all their sugar, saved the coffee, put aside whatever kinds of, they had a big garden, so they had lots of vegetables, but they prepared meat and didn't harvest it, or didn't harvest it right until before the men were coming. And she made cakes, and she had pie, and she had coffee. And the threshers come in, and they sit and look at this table, and one goes, "Parsnips? I love parsnips. I've never seen parsnips on a threshing table before." And but then she said she hears this undercurrent where they say, "How did they get this coffee? How could she make so much pie? They must be hoarders." And the two dirty words during World War I for civilians were being a hoarder and being a slacker. So she said that later she heard that many of the men had said really positive things about her food. But 50 years later, when she was writing this memoir, that label of being a hoarder, because she had and her family had sacrificed all their food for months in order to feed the threshing crew, it still really hurt. So, there are all of these understories depending upon when, who comes, what they have, and all these like stories we hear about food now. Oh, just eat the food that your grandmother would have recognized, or you learn to cook at your grandmother's knee. But I read these stories and I think, a lot of grandmothers were not good cooks, and so you just can't kind of trust that, and that kind of comes up here, where people don't want to go to a place because the food wasn't very good last year. But one of the great things about a really important recipe, a mysterious recipe that we have not found yet, came in Marr County. So Harold Zenter and Sarah's going to tell you a little bit about that family, I think. He wrote a memoir about, and a lot of these are up in the State Historical Society, just a great collection of stuff. And he wrote a memoir about how he enjoyed threshing time. Lots of men did, because they said they were well fed. And another woman had written that she thought the favorite desserts for threshing dinners were apple pie and white cake with lots of whipping cream. But this person said that he loved to go to Arcelia Smith's to work for the threshing because she served this recipe that he said the old-timers would look at the new hires and watch their face turn to amazement when they tasted her rum pudding. So I am on a quest for Arcelia Smith's rum pudding recipe. There is one old cookbook that I've located from White Sulphur Springs, and she has a couple of recipes in it, but not the secret recipe for rum pudding.
I bet we can track that down.
I hope so.
There's still a lot of good old timers with all those stories. And Harold he was an army cook, actually, right? I believe so. So he was the older brother to Howard Zentner, who he and his wife Carol are still in the community. And if any of you have been to the festival, he's the old guy that makes those wonderful little. He takes horseshoe nails and bends them into these little ant pins that he sells tens of thousands of them every year at this festival and makes a killing. It's fantastic. But their mother was a grand cook as well for all of these haying and working crews. And Carol said of his brother-in-law, Harold, that he was more of a mother-in-law to her. So take that for what it is. Should we talk a little bit about the cowbells?
Oh, okay. We can talk about the cowbells. What would you like to know about the cowbells?
Well, I think it's interesting with the lack of identity or even names for a lot of these female cooks holding the place together, really. When organizations started getting into the picture, there started to be some value and some roles that emerged. But the Montana Cowbells, and I think it was a national organization, was it not? Really allowed for a place for women to start some leadership roles and have a little more identity.
Yeah.
But mainly what I would like to know about the cowbells, since I read your article about them, is can you talk a little bit about beef fudge?
Okay, so we did rehearse this a little bit beforehand. And so first of all, we want to know if any of you have any idea or what you think beef fudge is. Micah? There were many more bizarre, I have to say, theories at dinner tonight, but that's absolutely correct. So the cowbells, and is anybody been a member or had a relative who was a member of the cowbells? Yeah. So this was a group, basically it started as the female auxiliary to the Montana Stock Growers Association, and it was true in a lot of different states. And but what happened was they came to see themselves, their job is a very gender segregated. So they argued that men raised the beef, even though we know that women were very involved in raising beef as well, but that women's job would be to promote the consumption of beef. So this is starting in the 1950s, and they're very media savvy right from the beginning. They use the radio, they use television, and they published several cookbooks. Montana Cowbell chapters published several cookbooks in the 70s. And they did all kinds of promotions. They had placemats, and they had this tall cardboard cutout of a thin cowboy called Montana Slim. And the motto was, "Eat beef, keep slim." And, they were just so creative, really. So they're the first groups to publish cookbooks that are solely devoted to one food, to beef. And there are 5 or 6 in Montana. And one of the things that emerged was beef fudge. And I do want to say right up front, this was a promotional idea. It wasn't, unlike some of the other recipes like beef muffins and beef cream cheese and things like that. But they would make beef fudge and they would take it to the legislature. They would stand in front of grocery stores to give out samples, and they would, then give out other beef recipes and things like that. So I was going to give a talk to the Wanderlust, the adult education group in town, and I was going to talk some about the cowbells, and my husband said, well, are you going to make beef fudge? You won't have any authority if you don't make beef fudge. So I did, and I looked at several recipes, and they all boiled down to take your favorite fudge recipe, and then you substitute for half of the nuts highly cooked hamburger, or in some recipes, shaved beef. So I went to the store and I got some local, organic, grass-fed, every adjective you want to use, beef, and I cooked that up until it was like little ants, little dark ants, little crispy ants. And I mixed it into the fudge recipe, and so I took it to the talk, and I cut it into really very small pieces. And they pretty much graciously ate it, but I still had a lot left, and I thought, what am I going to do with this beef fudge? So I was teaching my history of American food class, so I brought it to class the next day, and I said, gave them a little story, and I said, why don't you try it? And so some of them tried it, and some of them didn't. I still had some left. I was like, oh my God. I really don't like to waste food, but... and then one young man came up and he said, that was really great. And I said, the rest is all yours. But, I really think about how clever they were in the promotions that they did. And, the Billings paper, I think, one time said, beef fudge is a try it, maybe you'll like it recipe, but not many people try it. And but it certainly brought attention to them, right? It's the one thing you remembered from the cowbells essay, right? So, I think what Sarah said was, as I talked to some women who were involved in the cowbells, their purpose was to increase the consumption of beef. It was to help their family business, but they also believed that it was really healthy. And, they raised money to buy beef for home economics classes in the public school systems. They always had in their cookbooks lots of lessons about how to buy beef, what the different cuts were good for, the nutritional value of it. They lobbied the legislature. They really, took this as a protection of their livelihood, and a way that the beef industry, not just in Montana, but across the country, that they could help in a way that often wasn't recognized in these family businesses. So as a businesswoman, maybe you need something like beef fudge.
Chocolate-covered ants, something.
Yeah.
And the cowbells, I think, in the 80s might have shifted to the cattle women.
Yes.
And the Marr County cattle women for years have cooked the breakfast in the campground at our festival, which is fun. So they're still alive and well up in Marr County, at least. Excellent. Do you want to shift over to Rose Gordon?
Yeah, let's talk about Rose.
Let's talk about Rose.
Yeah. So one of the things that Sarah and I discovered was that we also shared an interest, and she also had a sort of building link to Rose Gordon. And do any of you know who Rose Gordon was, or some of you? So a few people. So Rose Gordon was an African-American woman, member of a family who lived in White Sulphur Springs. Her mother, Anna, was an ex-slave. Her father, John, was a free black who had trained as a chef. And they came to Montana in the early 1880s. So interestingly, Rose always saw herself, and was in fact a member of the Society of Pioneers in Montana. She came during the territorial period. Her father was hired to cook at a mining camp, and she was, so he came ahead and then sent for the family, and Anna Gordon took the steamboat up to Fort Benton and then over into the mining camp, and Rose was born there with a Native American midwife. her mother had taught her later that she said that Indian women were wonderful midwives, and that at first she had been quite scared of Native people. She had seen them from the banks of the, or from the steamboat on the banks of the river, and someone said, well, you just better nerve up, girl, because there's going to be a lot of people like that in Montana. And she and her mother, her mother in the mining camp used to invite Native women to come for tea and cake in her house, and they obviously exchanged some knowledge there. And so Rose, the family moves to White Sulphur Springs. Her father works in a hotel as the chef. And then he's killed in a railroad accident on his way to the Yukon. So Anna is left with Rose and 4 boys, I think 3 or 4 boys. And so she has to make her living. And she had been a cook as a slave. And so she did laundry. And then she worked as a cook. She opened a restaurant. It was known several times, Gordon's Restaurant, Gordon's Cafe. They moved from different building to building. She also catered for families. White Sulphur Springs had a lot of money in it at times, from the mining area, and women wanted fancy foods, and they could bring them in on the railroad. And Rose tells a story there's a biography of her written by Michael Johnson, which is very good. We recommend it. And Rose wrote an autobiography, and Michael used that, and she told a story about how this woman had brought in finger bowls. And so she sets the table, she puts the finger bowls out, one of the guests drinks from the finger bowl. And so Rose, a couple of guests drink from the finger bowl. So she takes the empty bowls back, she fills them with water, and she floats a 4-leaf clover in it to signal that you should not drink from this glass or bowl. So she has these, she's both Rose and her mother, and Rose had aspirations. She really wanted to be a nurse. And a couple of times she went into training, but she needed to come home and help her mother, and she did that really willingly. And we can talk more about the restaurants and her subsequent life, but Michael in his biography says this one thing that was really powerful to me. He said, for Anna Gordon, Rose's mother, being an ex-slave, making a home was an act of resistance. And so for those of you who know history, some of my colleagues, but if you think about this, one of the stories of women's history after the Civil War is slave women also worked in the fields. Some were cooks and some were house slaves. But they did the same kind of work that men did. They could not keep their families together. In many cases, they underwent no formal, marital right that we would recognize. Anna Gordon said that she was treated well, but in the next sentence she said she saw her mother, father, and sister sold away and never saw them again in her life. So after the Civil War, we have in the late 19th century white women organizing, for suffrage, to get better work, to be able to go to college. Many black women, what they saw as success was to create their own home. Right? The expectation that white women had homes. In the 19th century, middle-class women practiced what was called the cult of domesticity and argued that the home was a haven in a heartless world. But black women didn't have that ability to create a haven in the heartless world for their family. So for Anna Gordon to ask her daughter to come home from school so that she could help Anna keep this family house. They lost the house several times to taxes, and Rose would buy it back. It was a house that her father had purchased to keep the family together. That was an act of resistance against the way that white America had treated African Americans. So it was very powerful when you think about Rose's life. And Sarah has why don't you tell about hosting Michael at your house and the reaction to his book?
Yes, absolutely. So when I first learned about Rose, it was actually initially through her brother, Taylor Gordon, some of you may be familiar with. He was probably initially the more famous one. He grew up in White Sulphur as well, went on to become a famous Harlem Renaissance singer. And what was interesting is the shop I purchased where I have the Red Ants Pants commercial storefront up in White Sulphur on Main Street there. And I lived behind the shop right there for probably 15 years. It's an old historic saddle shop built in 1880, and it's on the historic registry, and I learned that Taylor and Rose had one of her cafes and laundries in that building. So over the years when we've had gatherings, and Rose was also quite a singer, I believe. And these walls have ears and they have stories, and anytime there's voices joining together in that space, it gives you the chills for sure. It's pretty powerful. But when Michael did this book on Rose, which was fantastic, that her story is getting told. We had a books meeting over at the Ringling Mansion, and brought a lot of old timers out and got to share their stories, and we all joined together in a lot of old songs that Rose used to sing in town, which was really neat, on the piano. And she was very well respected, Rose was, in the community from everything I'm gathering. And people considered her a very classy lady, in quotes, which is wonderful to hear, for sure, and an excellent, excellent cook. I guess her chicken fried dinner was something no one wanted to miss.
Yes, she became famous for her chicken dinners, and she advertised them, and I think it was one of the newspapers called her a manipulator of chicken, because she could cook it in so many ways, and that she would have these chicken deluxe dinners on Sunday night in her cafe. And, I thought, oh gosh, there's such stereotypes about African American people and chicken dinners, and there's books about this and everything. So just out of curiosity, I got onto one of the digitized newspaper databases, and I plugged in chicken dinner, and for the years of Rose's lifetime. And I got 16,000 hits all over. This was just in Montana, all over Montana. So everybody loved chicken dinners, and you could get a chicken dinner in any town. But Rose was famous for it. And one of the last things I had learned about her was Michael had kindly sent me. He had read the White Sulphur Springs paper before it was digitized, all those reels of microfilm, and he had copied all the various advertisements for Rose's cafes. And when I talked to him when he was here in Bozeman talking about his book on Taylor Gordon, he said that he would send me those, which was just a really great gift. And so he says in 1931, she changed her menu and added waffles. And so I thought, wow, Rose Gordon might be the first person in Montana to serve chicken and waffles. So I this is the coolest thing about food history, is trying to figure out when these foods emerged. So I looked up the history of chicken and waffles. And so a lot of people, several sources, attributed it to Harlem, New York, in the 1930s, a restaurant that in 1938 served chicken and waffles. And I thought, wow, well, Rose was, and I don't know if she actually served chicken with her waffles or just waffles were on the menu. There's no menu that we've been able to find. But I thought, so she was a predecessor. And I thought, well, maybe it was Taylor, because Taylor was in Harlem and he would bring that back. So then I did a little more research, and it turns out that the Pennsylvania Dutch brought waffles in the 17th century to the United States. Apparently, Thomas Jefferson started a bit of a mini waffle craze when he brought back waffle irons from Holland. And there were chicken and waffle picnics in the 1860s. President McKinley met his future wife at a chicken and waffle picnic in 1867, and he was attracted to her because he admired her appetite. So, I mean, really, isn't just being a historian, it's the greatest thing. So I can't say for sure that Rose Gordon was the first to put together chicken and waffles in Montana, but it's a great story.
Fantastic.
I feel like we should stop here, because that's a really good story, but we do want to let folks from the audience ask questions. Now's a good time to do
Well, I can speak loudly. I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the photos that are behind you.
So this is the Ingomar Kitchen Band. And so some of you know Ingomar is out in the big open, and obviously they needed to make their own fun and entertainment. So all these women have chef's hats. God knows where they got them, or maybe they made them. And they're playing different musical instruments made out of pots and pans and a rolling pin. The conductor has a rolling pin that she's using to conduct. This photo is from the Western Heritage Center in Billings. So the photos that you see are, some are from the Butte Silver Bow Archives, some from the Montana Historical Society, some from the Western Heritage Center, and some from the Montana Historical Society. Oh, and some from the Gallatin History Museum. So this past summer, my colleagues and I had a lot of fun tracking down images. Yeah.
Ingomar is the home of the Jersey Lily. I think one of the few bars that still has outhouses in use. Like the wooden ones,
Right.
not the porta potties.
I have a question about the recipes.
Oh, yes, we wanted to talk about this recipe. So, oops, this is it. So we have this recipe. The Ivan Doig archives are fully digitized, and they're available for anybody to look at the through the Montana State University Library website. And the handwritten recipe on one side of this is in Bessie Ringer's handwriting. It was not collected by Ivan. It was sent to him by a neighbor in White Sulphur Springs who said, I was going through my receipts. That was how another term for people, they called them receipts before they called them recipes. And I found this one in Bessie's handwriting. She said, my son used to hang out at the fence and say, Mrs. Ringer, do you have a cookie? And so she got this recipe. And if you can see, there's some interesting things about it because it's called date pinwheels, and there are no dates in the recipe. She uses raisins. And like many old recipes, it doesn't tell you what temperature. It doesn't tell you how long to cook them. It doesn't even tell you that you're supposed to put the filling on top of these cookies and roll it up into a jelly roll and slice them. So we have, come across thousands of recipes like this, where the assumption is that if you were reading this recipe, you knew how to make a cookie. And that, ovens were not, until you had modern ovens, they had no regulation on them. So, there were all kinds of methods of how long would it take for your finger to burn if you stuck it in the oven. That would be a really hot oven versus a moderate oven. So we thought that this would be a fun souvenir. And maybe, Jenny, do you know anything about the back of or Angela? Is Angela here to talk about the back of the
There's a recipe
on the
for
back?
kamut. Yeah, kamut is the free wheat seed that we're going to be giving out to people at Earth Day this weekend and at our Give Big donor lounge, generously donated by Abundant Montana. And this is one of the, I thought, easiest recipes their website had for you that didn't involve lots of proofing and overnighting. It's for biscuits. For kamut biscuits.
So if you make that, you can and come to the last two evenings of In Conversation, you can tell us the results of your baking. I can't see. Are there other questions or comments?
Thanks. I want to ask about. You mentioned how on a farm or a ranch, everybody gets a meal, and that's a beautiful tradition. With a hard day's work, you get a meal. So after threshing, Sarah mentioned the custom cutters coming through, and it occurred to me for the first time that maybe, do you feed the custom cutters when they come all the way from Texas? They're not your neighbors anymore, and a way is going with feeding anybody after a hard day's work because we're not on the farm anymore. What do you think the future is for feeding people after a hard day's work? That's such a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. It sure is. That's a good question. I think some places, at least that I'm familiar with, do still hire cooks just for the harvest season. They're actually bringing a lot of cutters in from South Africa and out of the country now. It's a growing trend of just getting farm workers from elsewhere. We have a lot of great dining establishments now in White Sulphur too that you can tell who's in town and what they're cutting. So I know all of them are not serving in-house like that. Having the facilities for them is probably another challenge, but.
We have a wheat farm in Fort Benton, and
Yay.
we have a wheat farm in Fort Benton, and we had custom cutters coming depending on the year. If it was a really fabulous crop, we wanted it done as fast as possible, but if it was a mediocre crop, I was the cook. And so it all depended. But when the cutters came, they also came with their families, with trailers and with some form that they were coming with. And they did come up from Texas, and their wives took care of their own men. And they weren't always cutting one day just on our place. They might have gone, our crop wasn't ready, so they'd go to the neighbor's crop. And so the cutters that were coming through would often serve a big community, not just our farm. But so that was one of the reasons I didn't ever have to cook for the cutters. But while they were cutting, we were also running our combine and our crew. And I was the younger one, and even though I had 3 small children, I took the evening meal out to the field. Mother-in-law did the noon meal, which was dinner, and they weren't really going that much early in the morning because we needed the wheat to dry out. And so she would feed them in her house, and then they'd go out to the field. And so between the two of us, cooked for the whole harvest. And so as far as the ones that are coming up from other places, I don't know how they're doing that. We still have cutters come, but like I said, mostly they're fed by their own families.
Hi. I've heard that there was a prevalent Black homesteader community in this region for a while, and your story of Rosie reminded me of that. I'm curious if you've come across that in your research at all, or seen any other food that's really relevant to the Black community in this area.
A Black community? I haven't. Micah, do you remember if Anthony found that? No. There was a Black community of homesteaders in Wyoming that came together, and there were other towns in the Midwest after the Civil War where a whole community would come and all take up homesteads in the same area. But yeah, if you hear more about that, most of the African Americans who were in Montana were actually in the cities because they worked on the railroad and then would sometimes stay. So Butte, Helena had the largest African American population. And there were more African Americans in White Sulphur Springs in the late 19th century because several came to the mining camps. But by the early 20th century, the Gordon family was the only family there. And that made it hard because Montana passed a miscegenation law in 1909, so people could not marry a person of a different color. So a lot of the Black people left Montana because they couldn't form those families that were so important to them.
And it's probably worth mentioning another great Ivan Doig book, loosely written around Taylor Gordon. It's called Prairie Nocturne, and it's brilliant just understanding that culture at that time and what a brilliant musician was going through with current racism of the day back in the 20s.
Yeah.
I think I'm one of the few people in the room who hasn't read This House of Sky, but I have read Last Bus to Wisdom, and in that book, the young man who's the protagonist, he has, it seems like he has a very idealized view of his grandmother as a cook, and that her role as a cook, she can really go anywhere, and it's a really, he has seemed a lot of admiration for her, and that she has a lot of mobility. And I'm just curious if you think that is like an accurate depiction of cooks at that time, or was it more his youthful idealization of it?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think that, I don't see, let me put it this way, in the early 20th century, sort of up through World War II, I do not see a lot of mobility. They're working in their family. They're working where their other relatives are, or moving. I mean, Bessie and Ivan and Charlie really worked in sort of 2 counties for their entire life. So part of it would be just how would they get to where they were going, right? If they were women cooks, they might not. They didn't make much money. They didn't have their own automobiles. So I don't remember that from the book. I'll have to go back and look now with new eyes. So thanks for that question. If anybody else has an answer, we'd love it.
Okay, thank you all so much.
We've got one more question.
Mary and Sarah. Please come back and join us for the next, I can yell, I can holler, for the next In Conversation series, May 15th, with Jill Falcon-Raymaker and Mariah Gladstone, Indigenous Food Sovereignty. So please come back and join us. And again, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's always fun to have a full house and a great conversation.